So I'll try to answer Rosemary's question, is there a deal? It'll take me a few minutes. The first part of my speech is going to be a little depressing, I warn you, but I'll try to end on a somewhat more positive note. When I first joined the US government under President Reagan in 1984, it was a couple of years after we had first discovered that North Korea was building a small research reactor at the Yongbyon nuclear facility. And there was a debate in the US government about whether or not this little reactor was intended to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. Of course, we know the answer now. Over the next 5 presidents and more than 30 years, we've tried many different ways to stop North Korea from developing nuclear weapons and missile delivery system. We've worked with North Korea's big power patrons, first the Soviet Union and later China, to try to increase political and economic pressure on North Korea. We've imposed unilateral sanctions and UN Security Council sanctions and export controls. We've tried to use military intimidation and threats. We've sometimes used sabotage and covert operations. And of course, we've tried diplomacy. The last 3 presidents have made deals with North Korea to limit its nuclear program in exchange for a variety of goodies, including nuclear power reactors, heavy fuel oil, rice, sanctions relief, and even baby food formula. And all of those deals collapsed because North Korea cheated or reneged on the agreement. So I think we probably did succeed in delaying the North Korean nuclear program over the last 3 decades. But let's face it, at the end we failed. So North Korea has conducted 5 nuclear tests, scores of missile tests. They now have a small nuclear arsenal. Nobody quite knows how many, but probably a couple of dozen nuclear weapons. They can be delivered by liquid-fueled no-dong missiles throughout the region. And most recently, under Kim Jong-Un, North Korea has made pretty significant progress in its missile delivery capability, especially development of solid-fueled systems. And presumably, North Korea is hard at work to eventually build the capacity to directly threaten the United States with nuclear-armed long-range missiles. So why have we failed? Let me offer 3 reasons, because I think these same reasons will continue to hamper our ability to deal with the North Korean nuclear program in the future. First, I think the North Korean government has a very deep conviction, bred into 3 generations of the Kim dynasty, that nuclear weapons are essential for the survival of the state in order to fend off North Korea's powerful enemies. First of all, the US, but also China, Japan, Korea. The North Koreans see threats all around them, and nuclear weapons is a way for them to deter those threats. As a result, I think it's very hard to design assurances and inducements that will convince Pyongyang that it's safe to completely give up its nuclear weapons. Under Kim Jong-il, he at least pretended like he was prepared to negotiate disarmament. Under his son, Kim Jong-un, he often refuses to even accept the pretense that nuclear disarmament is possible, and instead insists that nuclear weapons are an essential part of North Korea's government, including a part of its constitution. And one sometimes gets the sense that for Kim Jong-un, on a personal basis, in terms of his own personal prestige and power, being able to preside over and demonstrate advancement in nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles is an important part of his own hold on power in Pyongyang. The second reason why I think we failed is because our ability to compel Pyongyang to restrict or abandon its nuclear weapons and missile program is very limited, in part because of the nature of the North Korean regime. It makes it relatively impervious to external pressure. It's a very hard nut to crack. And also because Beijing is unwilling to impose economic sanctions that might crack the nut. Now, it's true that China, in the last couple of years, in response to Kim Jong-un's testing spree, has moved in the direction of more serious economic sanctions in the last 3 UN Security Council resolutions. But I think China is still very reluctant to impose the kind of economic sanctions that might lead to instability or conflict on the Korean Peninsula. The third reason why we failed is because we simply don't have viable military options to either disarm or destroy the North Korean regime, because the risks and the costs are just too great. Now, keep in mind that military options are important to diplomacy. It's not that you necessarily want to use them, but if the other side understands that you have that option available in extremis, it gives you a much stronger bargaining position. I think that's one of the reasons why the U.S. was successful in its nuclear negotiations with Iran. In the case of North Korea, our nuclear options have always, our options to use military force have always been severely limited. In the first place, because of Seoul's vulnerability to retaliation. But now that North Korea has acquired some kind of nuclear arsenal and a regional delivery capability, it obviously makes military options much more high risk and dangerous, because it could result in a nuclear attack on U.S. allies, Japan and South Korea. Even more modest, military options, like shooting down test missiles, is very tricky technically and runs the risk, again, of a North Korean retaliation, which might lead to a broader conflict. So those are, I think, the structural reasons that limit our ability to deal with the North Korean nuclear and missile threat. But let me try to turn to what I think is perhaps some more positive options that could present the Trump administration with at least some ways to manage the threat. I think one of the benefits of Kim Jong-un's refusal to negotiation and his very aggressive testing campaign is that he's created favorable conditions for the U.S. and the other important countries in the region, Korea, Japan, China, even Russia, to work together on a common strategy to constrain North Korea's nuclear and missile program in the near term, and at least begin a negotiation for nuclear disarmament in the longer term. The Trump administration's policy toward North Korea has sometimes appeared confusing and confused, mainly because of the president's tweeting and stray remarks in his interviews. But underlying that, the approach approved by the White House, which they call maximum pressure and engagement, is quite sensible. The administration is seeking to increase pressure on North Korea in order to set up a new round of negotiations. And I think the administration recognizes that military options and regime change are not very practical or desirable, and the only approach that is likely to be successful is some kind of diplomatic approach backed by economic and political pressure. Other administrations have come to the same conclusion, including President Obama and President Bush. Now, I think Trump has already reached agreement in a general way with Chinese President Xi Jinping and Japanese Prime Minister Abe on this overall approach, although there are probably disagreements on details and tactics. And now that there is a new elected president in Korea, Moon Jae-in, there's an opportunity for Korea to be a full partner in a working relationship with these 4 key countries. And I just came back from Korea, and I'm quite confident that even though President Moon emphasizes engagement over pressure, I think he can accept this overall U.S. strategy. As President Moon said in an interview with the Washington Post on May 2nd, which was actually a few days before the election, he said, quote, "Trump talks about strenuous pressure, sanctions, and even the possibility of preemptive strikes. But I believe his ultimate goal is to bring North Korea back to negotiations for the nuclear program. I agree with President Trump's method of applying sanctions and pressure to North Korea to bring them out to negotiate." End quote. And of course, both Trump and President Moon have said in principle they're prepared to meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un if conditions are right. In a way, Kim Jong-un has done a favor to Washington with this recent series of missile tests because it's forced other countries to focus on a pressure-first strategy, which is Washington's preference, to build up bargaining leverage. And last week, the UN Security Council passed another sanctions resolution in response to the series of recent missile tests. In terms of substance, the resolution is frankly not very serious, but at least a symbolic message to Pyongyang that China is prepared to support UN Security Council sanctions resolutions in response to missile tests. Previously, China's emphasis was very much on responding to nuclear tests, but I think the Chinese government is beginning to recognize that it can't give Kim Jong-un a free hand to conduct missile tests with impunity. So we'll see what happens. Of course, the big question now is, will Kim Jong-un continue to test, or will he take this latest Security Council resolution as a message that he needs to show more caution? If Kim Jong-un continues to test, then I think there's unlikely to be much opportunity to pivot to some kind of engagement. But if Kim Jong-un decides that he can pause in his testing program, having demonstrated that he has a credible, at least intermediate range missile capability, then the four countries and Russia will have to decide on what are the conditions for resuming negotiations and what would be the elements and the sequence of a proposed deal. In other words, what are we prepared to give North Korea in terms of sanctions relief, economic assistance, security assurances, and so forth, in exchange for limiting and eventually eliminating its nuclear and missile programs. As President Moon has already sketched out, I think it makes sense to consider some kind of staged approach that would begin with a moratorium on nuclear and missile testing, then lead to an interim stage which would prevent North Korea from advancing its nuclear capability, such as a freeze on fissile material production, and finally a stage when North Korea gives up its nuclear and missile programs entirely. And I think we have to recognize that this final stage, which would likely take many years to achieve, could coincide with a peace treaty ending the Korean War, with reciprocal diplomatic recognition by all parties, and security arrangements to maintain peace on the Korean Peninsula. I think President Moon is more willing than the previous two Korean presidents to be more generous in terms of addressing North Korea's economic interests and security concerns, but he'll also have to convince Kim Jong-un that he is prepared to withhold those benefits unless North Korea agrees to limit its nuclear and missile activities. So in conclusion, I think there are good grounds to believe that the US and the other critical countries in the region can agree on a coordinated strategy toward North Korea. But I have to say I have less confidence that this strategy will actually work. It may be that Kim Jong-un is determined to continue testing until he demonstrates the ability to attack the United States with a nuclear-armed missile. And in that case, I think we'll probably be trapped in the continued cycle of testing and sanctions that we've seen since the collapse of the Leap Day deal in April 2012. And of course, even if Kim Jong-un is prepared to take a pause in testing, we don't know that a comprehensive agreement can be reached. The talks might easily collapse after some period of frustrating negotiations. And of course, even if a comprehensive agreement is reached, we know from experience that Pyongyang can't be counted on to honor the agreement, since they have a record of cheating or violating or walking away from previous nuclear deals. Nonetheless, even if we're only able to achieve temporary limits on North Korea's nuclear and missile program, I think that would be a significant accomplishment to delay the threat and to reduce tensions. So to answer the question that's been posed, maybe there's a deal to manage the North Korean nuclear threat, but I think there's unlikely to be a deal that will solve it. Thank you all very much.
I want to ask Gary, based on what you said, you said that maximum pressure and engagement is a possible way to go. But the question is, how can this pressurizing phase be turned into engagement phase? Who and how can be done?
Yeah. So it's a very good question because we just don't know what Kim Jong-un's calculation is. I mean, he's obviously decided to sprint toward some greater capability, especially in terms of delivery system, but also in terms of nuclear testing. I think it's at least plausible to me that he's already achieved a sufficient nuclear weapons capacity, so he may not have any immediate need for additional nuclear tests. In other words, he may have confidence that he has a reliable nuclear warhead for his missiles. So the big question in my mind is his own calculation about how much more of a demonstrated missile capacity does he need, and whether or not what he's currently demonstrated is sufficient, and whether he will judge this is a good time to take a pause to find out what kind of benefits might be on offer in negotiations and to avoid additional sanctions, or whether he feels that he needs to continue to develop his missile capability by testing. And one theory is that he may not feel that he can actually negotiate from a position of strength until he demonstrates some kind of ICBM capability. And we just don't know the answer to that. But I think the only option we have is to make clear to him that if he continues to proceed with a testing program, there will be additional economic penalties. And as I say, I do think China has been moving in the right direction in terms of imposing broader economic sanctions on North Korea. And at the same time, make clear to Kim Jong-un that if we have a negotiation, we're willing in principle to look for ways to address economic and security concerns that North Korea has. None of that means that we're going to have a pause in testing. As I said, it may just be that he's determined to proceed for the time being with additional testing. In that case, I don't see where we have any alternative but to continue to build up economic sanctions as well as our defense capacity in the region. But at some point, he may decide, as his father and grandfather did before him, that it's worth accepting a pause in the program in order to see, what kind of benefit may be available.
But even if he decides to pause, as you said, so far our achievement is delaying the process. How can we go beyond this limited or humble success we had in the past and go beyond, this achievement we could make? How can we go beyond just delaying, but go all the way to the ultimate goal of denuclearization?
Right. So as I said, we have a long history of failure in terms of trying to resolve this problem, and I've come to the conclusion that with the current regime in place in Pyongyang and their deep commitment to maintaining an independent nuclear capability, I'm not sure there is a solution that would lead to complete disarmament unless there's regime change. And I don't think the U.S. Has the ability to bring about regime change. It may, of course, evolve over time. There may be spontaneous, political instability. There may be a coup d'etat that replaces Kim Jong-un. I mean, there are many different possible variations of things that could happen. But as long as Kim Jong-un is in power, it's hard for me to believe that he would ever actually give up his nuclear weapons. It certainly is not going to happen in the near term. So I think for the near term, management and limiting and delay is probably the only diplomatic options that are available to us.
Since you mentioned the past mistake, and since you are the first WMD czar of the Obama administration, right. I have to ask you this, but was the strategic patience mistake?
Well, I mean, strategic patience did not succeed in convincing North Korea to bargain over its nuclear weapons program. But of course, nothing else we've tried has worked either, as I said. Ultimately, all of our efforts have failed. And I think the main blame for failure is 99% North Korea. that they simply are not willing to, especially Kim Jong-un, seems so deeply committed to advancing the nuclear weapons and missile program, and he's simply not prepared to reach an agreement in exchange for whatever benefits or assurances that are on offer. The collapse of the Leap Day deal in 2012, I thought, was a pretty convincing demonstration that he really wasn't very interested in a diplomatic approach. He only waited 3 weeks before he violated the agreement, and that was, I mean, at least his father and grandfather, when they cheated, it was a little bit more subtle, and it took them a bit longer. In this case, it was pretty brazen, I thought.
You said a little bit about regime change, but in an interview that you gave to Associated Press 2013, you were quoted to say as follows, "It's not practical to achieve nuclear disarmament unless there is a change of leadership in Pyongyang or a fundamental change in the strategy of its ally, China." So you're saying either regime change or fundamental change of the China strategy. Right. Do you still believe that way?
Yes, I do. And as I said, I think regime change is not something we can control. I think North Korea is quite independent, and we don't have any influence. We have very little influence over, domestic political developments inside North Korea. I think even China has very limited influence over what happens in Pyongyang. I personally believe that China would be very happy to see Kim Jong-un replaced by a different North Korean leader who would be more respectful of China's interests. But I don't think the Chinese have the capacity to manage or engineer that kind of coup d'etat. In terms of China's shift of strategic interests, I think there is a very healthy and heated debate inside China about North Korea, whether it's a strategic liability or a strategic asset. As I said, I think China has moved in the last couple of years to the conclusion that Kim Jong-un is a strategic liability. But I think China still believes that North Korea, as an independent country, is a strategic asset. And I think from China's standpoint, the most desirable situation would be for North Korea to survive as an independent and economically a viable state, but with a different leader. But as I said, I'm not sure China is in a position to actually bring about that most desirable option for Beijing.
As for the regime change, as we all know, Secretary of State Tillerson said about a week ago, actually at the United Nations, that, I quote, "Our goal is not regime change," unquote. Was this a mistake?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm not sure that first of all, I don't think Kim Jong-un believes us, right? I think he believes and his father believe that our objective is regime change. So it doesn't matter what we say. But I think in terms of coordinating our policy with China in particular, I think it's important to make clear that we're not trying to bring about regime change. Of course, we would be delighted if regime change took place. I mean, nobody would shed any tears if this horrible regime was removed from the face of the earth. But it's not our policy, and we don't have the means to bring about regime change. And as I said, China at this moment is not prepared to support regime change in the way the U.S. means it, which is a fundamental change of the North Korean political system. So we're not going to be able to work with China unless we start from the premise that the purpose of sanctions is to produce bargaining leverage for a deal, not to produce political instability in North Korea.
I was in Singapore until the day before yesterday to attend the Shangri-La Dialogue. And in that conference, this issue has been extensively discussed. And Chinese delegation made a proposal how to move forward. And so let me check their idea against you. Their proposal consists of two phases of actions. The first is what they call suspension for suspension, to resume the bilateral negotiation between the United States and DPRK. And that calls for DPRK to suspend its nuclear and missile activities, while it also calls for United States and ROK to suspend what they call massive exercise. And this is a near-term goal to reduce the tension. And the second phase is what they call dual-track approach after the negotiation resumed. That seeks a parallel progress in first denuclearization of North Korea and second establishment of peace mechanism on Korean Peninsula. What do you think of this proposal of China?
Well, first of all, I agree with the structure that it's a phased approach. We're not going to achieve nuclear disarmament overnight. It's going to have to be structured step by step, and I think that's been true from the very beginning, from the negotiation of the Geneva Agreement. It was a staged approach. So that was true 25 years ago, and it's true today. In terms of the initial phase, I would have a slightly different formulation. I think a pause in testing, nuclear and missile testing, which would have to include satellites, I think that's a sufficient condition for starting formal negotiations for a comprehensive agreement. And then the question is, what does North Korea get in return for a test pause? And I think we can talk about different options. One option is sanctions relief. The Moon Jae-in government, I think, is prepared to resume the Kaesong industrial facility, the Kumgon Mountain project. So those are two possible issues that could be put on the table, with the understanding that if North Korea resumes testing, then those projects will get suspended again. So I think that there's the four parties, the countries that are involved in this issue, need to come up with a agreed position for what we would be prepared to offer North Korea in exchange for a testing moratorium. In terms of U.S. ROK military exercises, I think those exercises are essential for the common defense, for the U.S.-South Korean security relationship. So I wouldn't offer that early on in any negotiation. But you might think of ways to modify these exercises. For example, in the last couple of years, the U.S. has involved nuclear delivery systems as part of our joint exercises, B-2 bombers and things like that. Maybe in exchange for a test moratorium, we would suspend sending nuclear delivery vehicles to participate in those exercises. But this is an issue for Seoul and Washington to work out. And I think, I believe that Trump and Moon and their aides can come up with a reasonable proposal. I don't in any way guarantee that Kim Jong-Un would accept it. But, in diplomacy, it's always better to be the country that makes a reasonable proposal and have the other country be the one that rejects it. And that will come in handy when we need to justify additional economic pressure against North Korea. I'm sorry, one more thing.
Sure.
On the dual track, I agree with the dual track. I think that our objective should be to negotiate an agreement in which steps toward a peace regime and steps toward nuclear disarmament proceed in parallel. And on the day when a peace treaty is finally signed, or a peace agreement is finally signed, North Korea would give up its last nuclear weapon. Now, that's not going to happen in my lifetime, but I think that's how the agreement should be structured.
So in short, what's the difference between U.S. approach, massive pressure and engagement, and this China's proposal?
I think the U.S. and China agree and can agree on a common strategy, which is pressure to produce bargaining leverage for a negotiation. And my guess, I wasn't there, of course, but I guess that President Trump and President Xi Jinping discussed this at Mar-a-Lago. And, the U.S. is always going to be a little dissatisfied with the amount of pressure that China applies, and China is always going to be a little dissatisfied with the incentives that the U.S. is prepared to offer. I mean, there's a structural, difference between Beijing's position and Washington's position. So we're not going to have exactly the same position. But I think that thanks to Kim Jong-un, there's a better opportunity for Washington and Beijing to cooperate than I can remember in a long time.
When I discussed this issue, how Japan and the United States and ROK can get China on board in pressurizing North Korea to the point that they getting the kind of negotiation we'd like to have, and eventually make them dismantle the nuclear weapons, not just freezing the ongoing the programs of nuclear weapons and missiles. You know, the argument I always hear from experts like you is, it depends on China, how China sees North Korea. If China wants to maintain the North Korea as a strategic buffer between them and the United States or ROK, you know, they'll never increase the pressures to the point it could really make the regime collapse. And so I think this is a really fundamental question, how we can change the mindset of China to the point that we can have China to work as we would like to see, right? And you pointed out that a fundamental change in the China strategy is the key, along with the regime change. So let me ask you more in detail about this idea of making the China's strategic calculus. Right. Secretary of Defense Mattis said in his speech in the Shangri-La Dialogue a few days ago in Singapore, he said as follows, quote, "We believe China will come to recognize North Korea as a strategic liability, not an asset," end of quote. I think this is a key. How can we make North Korea a strategic liability for China instead of an asset as a strategic buffer? So I want to ask you, what's the way to, I think this is perhaps the best, if not only way, to change the mindset approach of China. Right. If they think North Korea is a liability, right, they will work on increasing the pressure. Right. How can we do this?
So I think the sad truth is that we're dependent on Kim Jong-un's misbehavior to change China's views. I mean, you know, as I said, China, because of Kim Jong-un's irresponsible activities from China's standpoint in the last couple of years, which have damaged China's security interests, including deployment of THAAD in South Korea, the Chinese have moved in the direction of applying greater economic pressure, although they're still afraid that if they apply too much pressure, it could lead to instability and conflict. So I think that in the future, if Kim Jong-un continues to behave in a way that damages China's national security interests, then it's more likely that China will be willing to support stronger pressure and may come to the conclusion that Kim Jong-un is a strategic liability and has to be removed. If Kim Jong-un is smarter and takes a pause and negotiates in order to calm the situation down and make the Chinese feel more relaxed, then it's going to be much harder to convince China that he's a strategic liability.
Let me ask you the utility of THAAD, deployment of THAAD in this context. Mm-hmm. THAAD is deployed to North Korea for the reason of defending South Korea from North Korean attack. And China is fiercely objecting this deployment. And it seems to me this is the one way to make China think North Korea is a liability instead of asset. Do you think we should push further with this kind of deployment of THAAD and in order to make China change their mind?
Well, I think it's inevitable that if we don't find a way to slow down or stop the North Korean nuclear and missile program, I think it's inevitable that there will be further strategic actions that the U.S. and its allies will take, and China will consider them to be threatening. So there will be more missile defense in the region if North Korea continues. There may be a regional system that ties South Korea and Japan and the U.S. together. There will be greater pressure in Seoul and maybe even in Tokyo for a return of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons to be based in the region, in Guam or even in Korea and Japan. So, it's inevitable that if nothing is done to address the North Korean threat, the U.S. and its allies will do things that China considers to be a threat to its interests. And I think the Chinese understand that. I mean, it's not as though the Chinese want to stop North Korea's nuclear and missile program. The dilemma they face is really one of fear. They're afraid that too much pressure would lead to another undesirable outcome, which is conflict or instability. And the Chinese are trying to manage these conflicting interests. And I think I am sympathetic with that. I understand that this is a difficult situation for China to be in. And North Korea is not a very easy friend to try to manage.
Finally, I'll give you the hardest question to answer. Give us the intellectual guess. What is going to happen from now on in what timeline?
Yeah, well, that's very hard. I mean, when Kim Jong-Un first took power, I was working in the White House with Danny Russell, and I made the mistake of thinking he would behave like his father, because I really got used, I mean, we all got used to Kim Jong-il's tactics. And he, you know, as I say, he pretended to be interested in nuclear disarmament, but he was prepared to negotiate deals and then cheat or renege on them. He was quite cautious in the way he moved forward, especially in doing things that would antagonize China. So I sort of expected Kim Jong-un to follow in his father's footsteps, and I've really learned that I was wrong, that Kim Jong-un is really a very different leader and seems to be you know, much more open about his ambitions, much more, you know, deeply wedded to public display of nuclear and missile capabilities, much less worried about hurting Chinese feelings. And so as a consequence, you know, I've been wrong over and over in predicting that now is the smart time for Kim Jong-un to take a pause and pretend to be interested in negotiating like his father did, to, you know, lower the temperature, start to erode the sanctions, see what goodies are on the table, and then he always has the option of breaking the agreement and resuming it in the future, as his father and grandfather did. But he's always surprised me by not doing what I consider to be the smart thing, which is to pause. And I think we're faced with that same question now. You know, has he got enough demonstrated capacity to, you know, be able to you know, resume negotiations, or are we going to go through months and years more of testing before he reaches that point? And I don't have any idea what his calculation will be.
Thank you very much. So now I would like to invite the questions from the audience. And we have 45 minutes, and I want to remind you, everything is all on the record. So your questions will be on the record too. And so before you pose a question, please identify yourself, name and affiliation. All right, then this gentleman over here. Please, wait for the microphone, please.
My name is Phil Ball. I'm a member of the National Council of American Foreign Policy. The perception, our perception of North Korea in terms of the economic reality, we hear how their people are in poverty, are in distress, food shortages and everything else. But is it true that during that same period, they've been able to remarkably build their infrastructure in terms of buildings and somewhat comparable to the way we observed China building in the early years? Is that an accurate observation?
I mean, I'm not an expert in the North Korean economy, but my impression is that the North Koreans are doing pretty well, especially in Pyongyang. I mean, I think there's a lot of poverty in the countryside, but I've talked to people, you know, diplomats who are stationed in Pyongyang and who've come back, and others who visited, and there are more cars on the streets. There is, you know, infrastructure development. I mean, housing and hotels, even restaurants. There are private markets springing up. So I think that, you know, the sanctions are clearly causing some disruption, and there may be segments of the North Korean elite who are unhappy because their access to hard currency is being curtailed by some of the recent sanctions. But I don't get the impression that the North Korean economy is anywhere close to a critical point. And in any event, the nature of the North Korean regime makes it almost impervious to public suffering. I mean, this is not like Iran, where there really is some democratic elements and public opinion actually does influence government action. This is a police state, and a brutal police state, and I don't think, you know, no matter how much people are suffering, it's not likely to put much pressure on the government to make concessions on critical security issues.
Okay. A gentleman over there.
Jerry Cohen, NYU Law School's U.S. Asia Law Institute. It's a pleasure to listen to your analysis, Mr. Samore, and we need much more of it. But one thing I noticed, and I want to make a comment and then ask you a question. The comment is, you did not mention tonight the very imaginative ideas you have in your national interest article with John Deutsch, which I think was only published in the last day or two while Mr. Kato was traveling. Right. One thing you said that was startling, that it might be possible to get North Korea to agree to store its nuclear weapons in China's custody.
Right.
That was just, if I had hair, it would have raised my hair.
Right.
You also said, and this is slightly more intriguing, that the Chinese might well be persuaded to put their troops between North and South Korea as a kind of peacekeeping exercise. I'm in favor of imaginative solutions because, as you point out, we're desperate to improve our situation. But I thought, although your article inveighs against fantasy, I thought those two suggestions approach the fantastic. But let me just ask the question. I don't think it's being asked yet very many people. Do you think the world community can come to accept a certain level of nuclear weapons in North Korean possession? We've learned to accept this in Pakistan and in some other places that could lead to instability. I heard Dennis Blair last week. He hinted about that. We might have to think the unthinkable.
Right. So I feel very strongly that we should avoid any kind of formal acceptance or recognition of North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, as we've done implicitly with India and Pakistan and Israel. So in some cases, we've sort of acknowledged the reality, we've accepted the reality that certain countries have nuclear weapons outside of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I wouldn't do that in the case of North Korea. I think that puts tremendous pressure on South Korea and Japan to develop nuclear weapons, and I would prefer to avoid that. So I think it's important that we continue to maintain the objective of nuclear disarmament, even though we all recognize that this is not a near-term prospect, and that the reality is that North Korea has nuclear weapons and will likely have nuclear weapons for many years to come. On the article that John Deutsch and I did, I mean, if we ever get into a negotiation with North Korea about an end state in which we give up their nuclear weapons in exchange for security arrangements, we're going to have to be very, very creative. Now, I agree with you that it's unlikely that North Korea would be happy to have their nuclear weapons safeguarded by the Chinese, and I think it's unlikely that the Chinese would want to put their troops as peacekeepers on the DMZ. But John and I were trying to sort of have some fun with thinking out of the box ideas. And, maybe part of negotiation is to take excuses away. So if North Korea says we must have nuclear weapons, we need to come up with ideas which they may not accept, but which challenge their assertion that they need to have nuclear weapons. And if North Korea rejects Chinese or international peacekeepers on the DMZ, I don't mind that.
You certainly achieved a stimulating effect on those who've read that article.
It's a nice thing about being outside of government is we can, all kinds of harebrained ideas are
Congratulations.
Is that gentleman with the cap, please, over here?
Nicholas Arena. I'm a lawyer. I'd be curious to know what the positions of the two Koreas are with respect to unification.
Right.
Or is that a fool's errand?
Well, I mean, it's a very good question. It's not exactly my expertise, but my impression, at least on the South Korean side, is that I think there's a pretty substantial generational divide. I think the older generation, both the conservatives and the progressives, still, you know, nurture the dream of unification, although they would go about it different ways. I mean, the conservatives would go about it by destroying North Korea, and the progressives would go about it by, you know, sunshine, by lots of affection and, you know, economic and social and, you know, cultural contacts. But I think the younger generation in South Korea doesn't care very much about unification. I think they, you know, have sort of, well, they have their own lives to live, and they recognize that unification would be very expensive. It would be very disruptive to, you know, South Korea's political system. So I think that the longer the two Koreas survive as separate entities, I think, at least in the South, there's much less appeal for unification. On North Korea, I can't speak. I just don't know. But I think the North Koreans basically have, for many years now, they viewed talk about unification as a threat to absorb them, whether it's from the conservatives through pressure or from the, you know, progressives through love. The North Koreans see both as equally dangerous and equally threatening to the survival of their system.
Thank you.
Okay, the gentleman on the front. Next, I go to back, so.
My name is Govind Singh. I'm retired from Merrill Lynch Bank of America. I fully subscribe to Non-Proliferation Treaty, but the country who are member of nuclear club, what moral authority do they have on other countries to refrain from developing nuclear weapons?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I agree with you. The U.S. is the last country in the world to be able to lecture other countries about nuclear weapons, because we were the first to develop nuclear weapons. We use them in war. We have, in my view, the best nuclear arsenal on Earth, and we're going to keep it for as long as one can imagine. So I don't think there's a moral argument. I think it's a national interest argument that for the U.S., our security and the security of our allies is threatened by North Korea having nuclear weapons. So that's why we don't want them to get them, and we want to try to have them give them up. But it's not a moral argument. It's simply a security argument.
That's the basis why other countries would like to have it.
I think, you know, from North Korea's standpoint, having, as I said, having nuclear weapons is a deeply entrenched belief. Now, most countries in the world, of course, have come to the conclusion that they don't need nuclear weapons for their security, either because they're not threatened in a way that raises questions about their existence, or because they have the protection of a nuclear power like the United States. But a small number of countries in the world, I mean, outside of the 5 declared nuclear powers that are permanent representatives at the UN, a small number of countries, India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, have decided that they must have nuclear weapons. And I think it's very difficult. Once a country has that conviction and once they've acquired nuclear weapons, it's extremely difficult to achieve disarmament. I mean, the only true case of disarmament was South Africa. And of course, that involved regime change, because you went from a white, you know, minority government to a black majority government, and they decided they didn't need the nuclear weapons that the white majority government had produced. Otherwise, in the world, there are not any cases where countries that really had nuclear weapons gave them up.
Okay, the gentleman in the white shirt. Yeah, it's you, right. Wait for the microphone.
Thank you, gentlemen. Brian Kelly with Asian Centric Quest. So we've been at this sanctions game now for decades, right. And it's often posited, and you've mentioned before, that there could be yet another level of ratcheting up sanctions, both economic and other political sanctions. Realistically, could you share with us what you think we can do from here in terms of applying further pressure?
Sure. So, I mean, much of this depends on China, because China has in its hands the ability to apply additional economic pressure. I know that the discussions in New York I mean, at the UN, the U.S. has proposed a number of additional sanctions, which so far China has not been willing to support. One option would be limits or even a complete suspension of oil exports to North Korea. And of course, this would apply not just to China, but to all countries, including Russia, which has exported oil. Another option is limits or an end to remittances from overseas North Korean workers, which is an important source of revenue for the North Korean government. There are additional financial sanctions that could be taken to limit North Korean banks' access to the international financial system, including the possibility of secondary sanctions that the U.S. could impose on Chinese and other banks. So I do think there are still some more, levers that we have in our toolkit. But to be able to get international agreement to incorporate them into UN Security Council, resolutions is going to depend, as I said earlier, on Kim Jong-Un. I'm convinced that if he carries out a 6th nuclear test, I'm convinced that we'll get another ratcheting up of general economic sanctions, because I think China will be so furious that they will support additional sanctions. Even if there's if there's a new rash of missile tests, including long-range missile tests, that might lead China to support additional sanctions against the North Korean economy. And Kim Jong-un, again, he has to make that calculation, right? How much is it worth it to him to continue testing at this point if it runs the risk of costing him a couple of $100 million, compared to other sources of revenue North Korea has?
All right, perhaps next, any lady? I don't see any lady. Okay, right here.
Hi, Rory Daniels, National Committee on American Foreign Policy. We've talked a lot about what North Korea's attachment to nuclear weapons is in terms of regime survival, but I'm also wondering what you think the risks are in terms of nuclear proliferation,
right.
Selling materials to other countries, and perhaps if you could comment on North Korea's other weapons of mass destruction. We think
right.
that they were involved in a chemical attack in Malaysia. What are the risks of proliferation of all weapons of mass destruction, and how does that change the calculus for negotiations?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, we know that in the past, North Korea has been willing to sell nuclear materials and technology. The most famous case is, of course, the reactor that they were building in Syria, which was bombed by the Israelis in 2007. So that was a very significant case of proliferation. They provided some uranium to Libya as part of Libya's centrifuge program through Pakistan. There's been, in the past, very close cooperation between North Korea and Pakistan on nuclear weapons and missile delivery systems. So there is a history there that clearly causes concern. And I don't know why North Korea hasn't offered nuclear weapons or nuclear material for sale. There probably would be a couple of countries in the world that would be willing to buy it, and certainly terrorist groups. As far as I know, that's never happened. Whether that's because the North Koreans are restrained because of fear that it will be discovered and there will be some retaliation, whether it's because they felt they couldn't afford to spare that material or weapons, they needed it all for themselves, I just don't know the answer. But I think it's something that's quite concerning and could radically change, international security, not just regional security. Because if North Korea sells, nuclear weapons to Iran or, some other country, that would very dramatically change the situation in the Middle East. I think, we've tried to make it clear to the North Koreans, and I hope other countries have as well, that would really be unacceptable. But whether the North Koreans understand that or believe it, I just don't know. In terms of other capabilities, we know so little. I think there's a general belief that North Korea has some kind of a chemical weapons arsenal and probably biological weapons. But as to, the exact type and volume and so forth, I really think it's all guesswork at this point. And, you know, the focus has always been on nuclear weapons, and I think that we'll be very far down the road before we're ever able to start tackling chemical and biological weapons.
You're a WMD expert. Were you surprised that North Korea used VX gas to assassinate Kim Jong-un?
So, I mean, of course, we've known that they've been working on VX, so the question is, why did they choose that particular source of assassination? And now, nobody knows, but I thought, for whatever reason, that because Kim Jong-un was killing somebody in his family, I thought for dynastic reasons they might have preferred to poison him as opposed to killing him in a way that would be more obvious assassination, like shooting him. But that's just my supposition. I mean, the North Koreans may very well have thought they could avoid getting caught, and maybe that's why they went through the trouble of, you know, duping these two women to use different parts of VX, which only became fully lethal when they were mixed together on Kim Jong-nam's face. But that's just my speculation. I mean, I don't know why they chose that particular method.
We still have 30 minutes. I'll try to get all the questions. The gentleman over there with the blue shirt and in suit. Yes.
Hi, Andy Laub, Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. Thank you very much for being here and for your remarks. North Korea is currently holding 4 American prisoners, and I just wanted to get your take what kind of leverage they may use as part of negotiations, and what we might be able to do to incentivize the North Koreans to secure their release, as we have done with prisoners in the past. Will it be a part of a bigger deal, or will it be some sort of side deal? Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I have students at the Harvard Kennedy School that often want to go to North Korea for tourism, and I tell them don't go because they're taking American hostages. And, you know, the North Koreans have been doing this for a long time, and normally they trade them for high-level visits. In other words, it's a way to try to coerce Washington into sending senior officials or former officials to go collect hostages, which is, I think, a really despicable practice. And I am not advising the Trump administration. They'll have to make up their own mind about whether they're willing to pay that price in order to get those people back. But I think people should stay away from North Korea. It's not safe. They will, whether you are guilty of something or not, as soon as these 4 people are released, they'll capture 4 more people. And I don't think it's part of a bigger deal. I think it's just part of trying to force, the U.S. to pay them respect and attention by sending senior people there.
Okay, next question. The gentleman over there with the red tie.
I'm Tom Nugent, Nugent and Company. The nuclear non-proliferation regime in the post-war era has been an unqualified success to the extent that nuclear weapons have never been used. And this results largely because there are a lot of very serious, thoughtful, and responsible leaders who have spent a lot of time and effort thinking about these issues and crafting policies, strategies, treaties, what have you. I wonder if you could give us your thoughts on the current Trump administration, and specifically President Trump. He has been quoted as saying, why do we have nuclear weapons if we don't use them? During the campaign, approximately 600 former U.S. submarine officers signed a letter to the New York Times questioning the advisability of following a directive from a President Trump if he should order the release of a nuclear warhead. So I guess my question is, how does President Trump view these issues?
Yeah. Well, of course, the answer is I don't know, but I've learned for the sake of my own sanity not to pay too much attention to what Trump tweets or says. I'm focusing more on actual policies because I think that, by and large, his foreign policy team is a very solid and respected group of people. I think my biggest reservation is that they really haven't been able to put their full team in place. So I think the administration is playing without having a full, team of players, which is really essential for managing all of U.S. foreign policy interests. And, truthfully, we've been very fortunate that there's been no foreign policy crisis. Because the Trump team really isn't settled yet in terms of personnel and procedures. But I do think McMaster and Mattis and Tillerson, this is a very strong group of people. And I focus more on what they do and less on what Trump tweets or says. In the nuclear area, by and large, Trump's policies so far have not deviated in any significant way from the Obama administration. And in particular, the Trump administration, I think, will proceed with the nuclear modernization program that that President Obama started. Obviously, President Trump has decided to make the North Korea nuclear issue a prominent part of his policies. Trump has decided to honor the Iran nuclear deal as long as Iran does. So I think, by and large, the actions of the administration in the nuclear area have not been, particularly upsetting or, disturbing.
Okay, the gentleman, the two rows behind it, the gentleman just asked the question. Yeah, right there.
As China responded to U.S. pressure to cut coal exports to North Korea, the Russians recently announced that they increased coal exports to North Korea by 70%. Could you flesh out the implications of these shipments?
So I don't know the particular details, but as a general matter, whenever Pyongyang and Beijing are fighting, the North Koreans turn to Russia as a counterbalance. And I think we're seeing that happen now because obviously the North Koreans are very unhappy with China for supporting these recent sanctions resolutions. And the Russians so far have actually, as you say, they've, as I understand it, provided some oil to North Korea. I was not familiar with the coal purchases, but that's quite possible as well. So I think eventually, as we construct an international coalition to deal with the North Korea problem, Russia will have to be brought in because it can act as a spoiler. And I, believe that just as Russia cooperated in the negotiation of the Iran nuclear deal, I believe that Russia, at the end of the day, if they're brought into this process, will be a positive and constructive player.
I understand there are media representative among the audience, and I'd like to give a chance to media to ask questions. Okay, gentleman over there. Not because I'm for media, but the publicity is important for this event. So.
Hi, my name is Masato Shinagata with Kyoto News, a Japanese news agency. In the opening remarks, I was a little bit surprised you're talking about covert operations in North Korea in the past. Could you give us some examples of it? Now it's been 20, 30 years, and there's a vacancy at the top job of FBI right now. You can say anything.
I'm saving those for my memoirs. But I will say one thing in general, that covert operations are not a magic bullet. They are another tool like export controls and sanctions and diplomacy and military threats. I mean, these are all instruments that are used by the U.S. and other countries. And even though they're kind of sexy because they're secret, they're actually, they have limited utility.
Just to follow up very quickly, you've been also mentioning about the regime change in North Korea, and that's what you were hoping for. And in 1994 in Geneva, you heard the news of the death of Kim Il-sung,
right?
And where I was there, and you were there, and I thought you were not surprised at all. And did you know that?
No, I can't remember how we learned about it. I remember I think the North Koreans may have or maybe the South Koreans contacted us, but Yes, I was surprised.
So it wasn't an assassination?
It was not, as far as I know, it wasn't assassination. Although I think maybe the South Korean president may have tried to take credit for it, as I recall. I mean, not through assassination. But I think that, I want to make clear, I'm not expecting regime change. I mean, I have no basis on which to believe that, regime change is likely. And as I said earlier, I think in particular a popular uprising, a kind of Arab Spring-like uprising, I think that's very implausible in North Korea, because I think the regime is just too brutal. I think a much more likely scenario would be some sort of palace coup, some sort of assassination within the inner circle. That's much more likely. But if that happens, it'll be, a complete surprise to, me and probably everybody else outside that inner circle.
Thank you.
Gentleman with the white paper.
Herbert Levin, a member of every organization. If you look at the countries concerned, as you have indicated, the Russians are kind of peripheral. Hopefully they will not be a problem. The Japanese will be very interested, but not very active, because they understand, though opinion in South Korea has changed from we'd rather be conquered by the North than saved by the Japanese, it's more mellow than that. Still, Japanese participation is very limited. And you have accurately described the Chinese, who were furious when North Korea attacked South Korea, and have had a lot of problems with the North Koreans ever since. Now, the question is the South Korean attitude. The South Korean attitude in the past, as you have indicated, at times, through democracy, they have selected leadership that has been just short of march north, and they have sunshine policy, and now they have a new government, and he has a record of very interesting statements in the past. Right. My question is, what differences do you see evolving between the South Koreans and the Americans in what we expect, hope, may be some kind of a track 3-2-1 negotiation with the North?
So it's a really good question, Herb. And as I said, I've just come back from Seoul, where I met with some of President Moon's advisors, as well as the professionals in the South Korean government. I think that, of course, the progressives have been out of power for 10 years. So a lot has happened in 10 years, including, most importantly, Kim Jong-Un rather than Kim Jong-il. But I think President Moon and his advisors genuinely believe that a deal is possible, that it is possible to negotiate an agreement that would lead North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. That may be naive, but that's what they believe. And I think they're much more willing than the last two conservative presidents to use economic cooperation. They still believe that economic cooperation and assistance over time will help to bring about a peaceful unification, and will help to address North Korea's concerns and give North Korea a stronger vested economic interests in peace and so forth. And I think the Moon government will be more interested in having a somewhat more independent defense capacity in terms of their relationship with the United States, and therefore they may be more flexible on issues like missile defense and joint exercises. Now, I don't know whether any of this is, I'm skeptical that any of this will produce a real deal, but I also think that it's in our interests, since we haven't been doing that well, why not give Moon Jae-in an opportunity to see whether or not he can make some progress, and in particular making progress to set up conditions for a negotiation, which means a pause in testing. So I hope that when Trump and Moon meet, I hope there's an agreement that, that we would favor an overture from South Korea to try to establish conditions for negotiations, meaning a test pause, and that there be a discussion about what South Korea would be prepared to do in exchange for a test pause. I mentioned some of the projects that had been suspended under President Park Geun-hye. So I'm somewhat optimistic that, I mean, even though there were a lot of tensions in the relationship under the last progressive president, under Roh Moo-hyun, I'm somewhat optimistic that Moon and Trump can come to an agreement on a division of labor, where we, continue to play bad cop for the time being, and where the South Koreans can make an effort to, be the nice cop. Again, I'm not super optimistic that's going to work, but I think it's better to let Moon try, and if he fails, we can blame Kim Jong-un.
Since the gentleman mentioned Japan, and we are at the Japan Society, right, and the Japan Society hosting this event, actually asked this question: what's the role of Japan that you would expect to play?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Of course, Japan was very deeply involved in the original, Geneva Agreement, because Japan was directly part of the light water reactor project. But since then, Japan has been pretty much on the margins. I mean, part of the six-party talks, but has not been willing to, participate in any of the agreements. I think in part because of the disappeared persons issue, and that may continue to be the case.
Abductees issue.
The abductee issue.
Right.
So, there may not be a big role for Japan to play in any agreement, except as an important regional country that would, presumably be part of six-party talks if they're ever reconvened again. But I think for the security issues, and especially if we go down the road of trying to negotiate an armistice, the four key countries are China, U.S., and North and South Korea. So there may be a separate track on security issues that don't involve Russia and Japan.
I see. Okay, the gentleman in the middle.
My name is Bernard Barton. Oh, wrong side. I'm a former Army intelligence officer, which some might view as a contradiction in terms. But if you go back a little bit in history, we were faced with a very similar thing in Cuba. We had missiles, not thousands and thousands of miles away, but 90 miles.
Right.
And if history is correct, Bobby Kennedy went to the Russian ambassador and told him, Kennedy can't control his military, which was true. History demonstrates this. Now, despite Mathis having a name as Mad Dog, I don't think he has that mindset now, but there are some in the military that do. But I think the more cogent point is, as you said very accurately, that China is the key. And I don't think we're doing enough to pressure China, because we, if not the largest, the second largest importer of Chinese goods in this country, and President Trump already talked about a border tax, which would devastate China. They need us more than we need them. And that was noticeably absent from some of the suggestions to get China to go along.
So it's a very good point. I think that the Chinese are a little nervous. On one hand, they think that Xi Jinping has convinced Trump that China is exerting strong pressure, and Trump seems to be satisfied with his good friend Xi. But on the other hand, I think the Chinese are a little worried that Trump will wake up and realize that actually China is not supporting sanctions as strongly as they might, and that Trump will, react in a very unpredictable and angry way. So I think it's going to be a very interesting story, how the U.S. and China go forward in terms of, coordinating policies, where the U.S. has to provide some of the incentives, especially in the security space, and the Chinese have to provide some of the sticks in terms of the sanctions space in order to have a comprehensive approach. And again, I'll say a lot of this depends on what Kim Jong-un does. If Kim Jong-un does what I think would be the smart thing and take a break from testing, then I think China is going to be unmovable on additional sanctions. If Kim Jong-un does the rash thing and engages in more testing, especially more nuclear testing, I think the Chinese will move in the direction of stronger sanctions. I mean, part of me is applauds every time Kim Jong-un tests, because I think he just drives the Chinese closer into our arms.
Okay, gentleman over there.
I'm Professor Isaac. I only know what happened in the world 3,000 years ago, but I still have some naive questions about the modern world. If it's my understanding, the original breakup from the north to the south was ideological. I guess the north became communist supported. In the world in which these ideologies have broken down, Russia, China, and many others, what still remains in a way as a big barrier between the north and the south? And as a footnote to this question, I guess when you speak about regime change, you have to know something about the person who is at the top of the regime. What exactly is the basic source of the power of the leader? In other words, is it tribal? Is it political? In other words, where does such a big power he has come from? So I hope my naive question is clear about where is the ideological fight now between North and South? No communism in the world, at least, if not 100%. Thank you.
So, North Korea is a really unique political system. There's nothing like it anywhere else in the world, because you have a combination of a dynasty, and under that dynasty, it's not just the Kim family. There are sort of other families that are connected to the Kim family through marriage and patronage. So there's an aristocracy underneath the Kim, and then you have the elements of a one-party state. You have a North Korean Communist Party, which has the same kind of penetration into the state that the Chinese Communist Party has. In other words, you have political commissars throughout the state structure in the military and the secret police. And then you have a police state. You have a absolutely brutal secret police that execute or send people to education camps, and a very heavy military. So there's nothing like it, and I think that's why it's very difficult to. We don't know anything, or we know very little about what goes on in terms of North Korean politics, especially within that inner circle. We know Kim Jong-un has done a lot of house cleaning, including family members, in order to kill or remove people, and seems to have succeeded in consolidating his position. In the sense that people at the top all owe their position to him. But there are institutions, right? There's an army, there's a secret police, there's a party, and these sort of instruments of power are more than just, I think, the top people. They're structures. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so, skeptical that we're likely to see any kind of public uprising anytime soon. And, the most likely change, as I said, is likely to be something that happens at the top. And whether that leads to a fundamental change in North Korean policy, I don't know.
Okay, the lady in the middle.
Thank you. Ariana King with the Nikkei Asian Review. So you've described North Korea as a brutal police state. I'm wondering, in the past, there have been attempts, especially within the UN, to link the security situation with human rights.
Right.
I'm wondering if you see human rights making any way into such a deal, maybe even as an impediment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think as hard as the nuclear issue is, I think human rights is even harder, because that directly attacks the entire survival of the regime. They cannot allow, political freedoms or even personal freedoms without jeopardizing their control over power. So of course, we should be clear about what the situation is. And I think, recent actions by the UN, including the report by the Australian judge, those are very important so that everybody understands the nature of this regime. But I think it's awfully hard to imagine you could form a very strong international effort on human rights, especially because China is very, very ambivalent. Unlike nuclear issue where there's a strong overlap of common interests, it's very hard to persuade China to join in putting pressure on North Korea with respect to human rights and political expression and so forth. So I think it's a really, really tough problem.
This is working. Just to clarify, it means you think that any such deal on the nuclear front would be separate from human rights?
I mean, getting a deal on the nuclear front is just about impossible. So if you want to add, human rights and missiles and chemical weapons and biological weapons, then, it just makes it more impossible.
Okay, gentlemen over there. Yeah.
Benedict von Schroeder, I'm an investor. With all what we heard, are we better off maybe not in accepting that they have nuclear weapons, but better off in assuming that they will reach, at some point in the not-so-distant future, the capability of having missiles, nuclear missiles coming to the United States? Aren't we better off in just assuming that and then take it from there?
So I think it's a very good question. I think, looking at this from a historical perspective, which I talked about in my speech, I think the most likely outcome at the end of the day, not right away, but at the end of the day, the most likely outcome is that North Korea will acquire the ability, on paper anyway, to directly attack the United States with nuclear weapons. We should try to do everything we can to prevent that and stop it, but I think that Kim Jong-un has a very strong motivation to acquire that capability. In that case, we're going to have to rely on both defense and deterrence in order to protect ourselves and our allies. And, I do think it's very important that we invest in improving our missile defense system. Missile defense is not going to work against big nuclear powers like Russia and China, because they can always build more. But North Korea has very limited resources, and compared to countries like Russia and China, very limited technical capacity. So I think it's at least plausible that we could field a missile defense system in the region and nationally that would provide some degree of protection. You're never going to be 100% confident that it'll be perfect, but I think it's worth investing in it. And beyond that, we have deterrence. I mean, Kim Jong-un is homicidal, but he's not suicidal. And he knows that using nuclear weapons would be the end of his life and his country. So, I do think deterrence, I'm not happy with the situation. I would vastly prefer that North Korea not have nuclear weapons, but I do think deterrence works. I mean, I think we've seen peace on the Korean Peninsula since the Korean War because of deterrence, because North Korea knows that it can't afford to engage in another military conflict with the South. And I think as long as the US and the ROK and Japan maintain a strong military capacity, that deterrence has a good chance of continuing.
Go ahead.
How real is that threat of retaliation, which has worked through the Cold War? Yes, but with the proximity of South Korea to North Korea, how real is that really, that we would then basically retaliate with a nuclear action against?
Well, I mean, fortunately, we don't have to use nuclear weapons against North Korea. I mean, North Korea, we have much better conventional options to retaliate against North Korea than using nuclear weapons, which would kill, many innocent North Korean civilians. So I think the U.S. response in the first instance is much more likely to be conventional. But in any event, from Kim Jong-un's standpoint, it's a death sentence if he uses nuclear weapons. So I think we want to continue to reinforce with him that, I think the very believable threat that there would be a retaliation against nuclear use that would be the end of his life and of the regime.
I have to wrap up soon, so at the end I'll take maybe 2-3 questions together and ask Dr. Samore to answer these questions with his concluding remarks. So, anybody questions?
Comment on Russia.
The gentleman over there.
Hi, Andy Busser with Pitcairn Family Office. So if we play out what you described, where North Korea does develop the ability to deliver a nuclear warhead to the United States and presumably develops more than one, so what then is Kim Jong-un's end game? What does he think he's going to get? And could he get some of that without developing nuclear weapons?
Right. One more, anybody? Okay, the gentleman in the middle.
What is China?
I'm going to give you the microphone next, so just hold on.
Thank you. Sun Yu, just the concerned South Korean living in America. So you briefly mentioned about the B-2 bomber getting involved in the, newly involved in the military exercise and deployment of THAAD being an issue. Do you not see that the military side of pressurizing is getting to a little bit higher gear by intent or just organically getting there? That might evolve into some more attention and military driven development of the issue.
Okay, gentleman back there, final question. Thanks for the patience.
Thank you. Is this on? Sorry. Try this one. Hi, thank you. I'm actually, among other things, a member of a North Korean study group, and some of the chatter we hear is that about China's red line, and I wanted to ask you if you've heard the same. So much as a cracked window pane in Manchuria or northeastern China, or this Japan Society, formerly known as Manchukuo, is the red line, and it could be good enough for an invasion by China, conventional. And the other thing that may be holding up President Xi is he is trying in the process, this is again possible speculation because China is largely a black box to most of us, of consolidating power after the Congress meeting or something in the fall. I'm not a China expert, I don't pretend to be. And because right now the way it's currently structured in China, there are very many pro-North Korean elements that are resisting any efforts he may be making at, trying to manage the North Korea problem more effectively before any window panes start breaking in Manchuria. Have you heard similar?
So the three questions on Russia and your concluding remarks also.
So let me start with the question about Kim Jong-un's calculation. I mean, it's a very good question, and I keep saying over and over again, I don't know what his calculation is. I mean, one argument would be that he would have the best bargaining position if he comes right up against, if he comes very close to having a demonstrable ICBM capacity, and then tries to negotiate a deal with the US to stop short of actually acquiring that capability, that he would have maximum bargaining leverage. Because once he demonstrates he has an ICBM, then, in a way that makes the US less interested in diplomacy and more interested in missile defense. Whether Kim Jong-un has that same calculation, I just can't tell you. He may feel that he really can't, deal with the US on an equal basis unless he can destroy Los Angeles. I just don't know what his calculation is. On the question of, the military risk, I think what's happened recently is that both sides are doing a lot of saber rattling. And the U.S. is engaging in classic gunboat diplomacy, sending our aircraft carriers to, sail around, the Korean Peninsula. And of course, we have our military exercises, and the North Koreans are experts in making blood-curdling threats. But I think it's all just noise. I think both sides are very well aware that a war would be, disastrous. And both sides are avoiding actions that could inadvertently escalate to conflict. You notice, since Kim Jong-un has taken office so far, he hasn't carried out any of the conventional provocations that we saw at the end of his father's, regime. There's been no, Waipido Island shelling, no Cheonan sinking. He's been pretty careful about what he does in ways that could lead to a South Korean retaliation and escalation. If you talk to the U.S. military, they are very, very aware that a preemptive attack to destroy North Korea's nuclear and missile capability is simply not practical. We do not know enough about the location of those facilities or weapons to be able to, reliably destroy them all. And in any event, a large-scale attack on North Korea's nuclear and missile program would very likely trigger a general Korean conflict, and that's not something the U.S. military has any interest in getting involved in, especially because we have, military commitments in the Middle East that we can't get rid of, including Afghanistan. The only military option that I think, people are seriously looking at is the option of shooting down test missiles. And as I said, there are some technical complications with that, and again, it would be somewhat risky because you don't know what Kim Jong-un's reaction would be. But I think people are very seriously looking at that kind of a military option if Kim Jong-un continues what he's been doing. China red line, I've also heard that the Chinese would be, very angry if there's a venting of a future North Korea nuclear test and that it could spread some radiation in China or break windows. And, that may be a constraint on North Korea's nuclear testing program if they're working on thermonuclear weapons, which have a much higher yield than the kind of atomic bombs they've been testing up to now. It's much greater risk that there would be a venting if they test a higher yield weapon. So that may be one reason, possibly, again, we're just speculating, that could be one reason why Kim Jong-un doesn't see much advantage in continued nuclear testing because of the risk that it would lead to a much stronger Chinese reaction. I'm not sure invasion is a very plausible Chinese reaction, but certainly more sanctions. And finally on Russia, Russia is a relatively marginal player on this issue compared to the other 4 countries that are critical. But I do think, as I said earlier, as North Korea reaches out to Russia and as Russia looks for a greater role to play, I think it's inevitable that Russia in some way will be part of this discussion. And I think at the end, the Russians will not try to spoil any negotiation. I think that Russia's relationship with China and Russia's relationship with the other countries will limit the extent to which Russia is prepared to act in a way that would jeopardize any diplomatic deal.
Well, thank you very much. I think we had a pretty comprehensive and extensive discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it. And thank you very much for participating. And the reception is on the ground floor, and you're all welcome. And join me thanking Dr. Samore at the end.